The other day, I'm having dinner with my father, who comes from the hometown of Amarillo, Texas, and he starts to tell me some stories about his experiences with the Funk family, mainly Terry Funk. The first story he shares with me is of a time when he's about 4 or 5 years old, and this is the mid-50s. My dad grew up incredibly poor, so he came from the barrio, which is a Mexican ghetto. And on weekends, him and his older brother and cousin would just go and hang out at the movie theater. And one time they're there, and his brother and cousin freeze, and my dad's kind of wondering what's going on, and they point, and there's this big, huge guy, and they go, "Oh my gosh, that is Dory Funk Sr." They might not have said the senior part, but he's ordering tickets, and he has 4 little kids with him. So my dad just runs over. He's not afraid. He's just incredibly impressed with this, gigantic, larger-than-life figure. So my dad's just standing with this group of kids and looking up at this wrestler, and, sure enough, Dory Funk Sr. turns around with a handful of tickets. He has 4 tickets in his hand. And when he turns around, he sees 5 kids looking back at him, and so he jumps like he's startled. And he slowly cocks his head over and narrows his eyes and looks at the tickets he's holding, and he counts 4 tickets. He looks back at the children and does a head count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And goes back to looking at the tickets. He counts 4 tickets, looks back at the kids, does another head count, 5 kids. And then he looks over at my dad, this little tiny brown kid. Now you have to understand, this is the mid-50s. Integration of white kids and Mexican-American children wouldn't happen for another 10 years. For the most part, a lot of whites did not interact with the Mexican-American culture at the time. This moment was incredible because Dory Funk, being a dad, just looks over at my dad and laughs, big belly laugh, and then rubs his hands through his hair, tousling his hair and messing it up, and then walking off with the 4 kids to go see their movie. And it was hilarious because nearly 70 years later, my dad was still laughing himself to tears, sharing this story with me.
Well, that's a feel-good story to start off. Feel good because it's nice to know that our heroes in wrestling aren't all pieces of shit. So you can think of a time when the Mexican Americans were shunned by the white men of Texas, and it takes the wrestling community to know that all people shall be treated equal, especially a little kid, cute little kid, to not care about any of those things and have appreciation for all. So shout out to Dory Funk Sr., and that makes sense too. Terry Funk seems to love all. I don't know if there's a bad thing about Terry Funk. I hope I said this and I don't go looking back and there's a lot of bad things, but I got to assume that he was a good human all around. Still is a good human, still hanging in there, Terry Funk. So I love these kind of stories. There's like some old grainy old footage of old time wrestling, but it's not that often that we get to make a picture of old time wrestling outside of the wrestling ring in just a situation where they're going to the movies, and we get to play that picture in our head of the Funk family and this caller's father retelling a story. That was just one story from the caller, and they then continued on with another one, which I think we'll go to right now.
So in 1969, my dad actually joins the Army and gets sent to Germany in the height of the Vietnam War, where my dad decides to end up becoming a hippie after being enlightened by the music of Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin in concert. So upon his return to Amarillo, not only is he a Mexican-American, but now he's a hippie, which is even more strange than, anything anyone can understand nowadays. But my dad's first job outside of the Army once he left is he actually worked advertising for the Amarillo Globe News, and his main customer was Terry Funk. And my dad's job was to go to Terry Funk's home, and each and every time his wife would be the one that would answer the door, and she would let my dad in, and my dad would be taken to a side room, and in the very next room would be Terry Funk, Dory Funk Jr., and Ricky Romero painstakingly, at least to my dad's ear, planning out matches, what moves were going to be done, what the storyline needed, but very professional, going through it bit by bit by bit. And then after a bit, Terry Funk would excuse himself and come into the room with my dad and look over proofs or samples that needed his approval to be run as an advertisement. And, Terry Funk was very concise and would go through it, talk about, oh, well, I don't like the font, or can you make this bigger, or can you make it curve more? I don't like the photo you used. What about this photo? And my dad worked with him for several years for the Amarillo Globe newspaper before subsequently leaving to pursue a dream and working in ambulance. And my dad would later on become a EMS chief of the town he ended up moving to. But he always loved those memories, but said he could never share them with anyone. Even with this, he wouldn't make the phone call to you because he was afraid of Terry Funk retaliating against him.
I was thinking, well, you should just have your grandpa call. He probably has so many great stories. And then we bust out, Grandpa's still keeping kayfabe. Not even keeping kayfabe. He's scared of the Funks. The 78-year-old Terry Funk, or whatever he is, the 80-year-old Dory Funk. He's afraid of getting that spinning toe hold or stretched. I would be too. Terry Funk is a scary, scary man. I guess something that re-popped into my head after listening to both these calls is I've never been to Amarillo, so I don't know how big or small it is, but by this phone call, it seems kind of small that in your youth you run into the family at the movies and then you go off to war, you become a hippie, you come back. Now you're doing sales for the family over the TV station. It's so wild that we just assumed wrestling was so real for so long, but there were so many people just like this guy who were involved in the little things where you have to be like, yeah, it is what it is. You know what it is. Or they're not afraid for someone to overhear. I mean, we hear about Haku biting off a nose, yet here's Terry Funk, who believes in it just as much as Haku, happy to go over matches while the ad sales guy is in the other room. And I kind of wonder, was he a giant wrestling fan, or did he just kind of know because the Funks are always in Texas and they're legendary, kind of like the Von Erichs in Dallas, if you will? Because what a great job if you were a wrestling fan and then you got to do the ad work or the marketing for the television that they're doing. And remember, this is the territory, so it's not just like the Funks. There's 70 of these all over the country, if not more. Everybody has a job like this where they're just talking to the wrestling people, figuring stuff out. Well, I'm glad your grandpa has so many great memories of the Funks. Please let him know that he's free to call in. I have a feeling Terry or Dory or Dory's wife isn't listening to this podcast, and even if they do, I'll make sure he's protected. Hey, thanks for watching. That call was part of a whole podcast called Wrestling Anonymous. Listen to the whole thing weekly. Wherever you listen to your podcast, go subscribe. And while you're at it, subscribe right here on YouTube to Colt Cabana's channel. Thank you.